Chapter 26, The Great West and the Agricultural Revolution, 1865 to 1896. So this is the last chapter of this group of chapters that deals with the same time period. And obviously this deals with the western United States. It deals with a lot of the Indians, and then also the rise of the Populist Party due to farmer discontent over monetary policy. Exciting stuff. Back in the day, this chapter was very, very lightly covered, and then starting about 8 years ago, you started to see more and more of the monetary policy and populist party stuff pop up on the AP test, and then the last few years, you're seeing more and more of the Indian stuff pop up. So this chapter has been rising in popularity among the College Board lately. So it's turned into a fairly important chapter. Okay, so the Indians, and the Indians from the Great Plains, the western area there. There's hundreds of different tribes in American history, and the College Board does not expect you to memorize all of them, all their names, or even where all of them are at. Obviously, you have to know the Taino Indians. Those are the ones that Columbus first came across. The Powhatan Indians. Those are the ones that Jamestown was near. You have to know about the Iroquois Confederacy. That those were the guys that were in the New York State area there. You got to know about the Cherokee who were in Georgia. Remember, that's that big thing during the Andrew Jackson presidency. The Navajo to a certain extent in the Southwest, and really the Sioux. And I put the Cheyenne in there also, but really the Sioux. The Sioux Indians are the main tribe that the federal government fights during the Indian Wars in the aftermath of the Civil War, between the Civil War and 1900, we'll say. And we're talking in the Great Plains region, so Colorado, Wyoming, the Dakotas, Montana, that area right there. Now, the Cheyenne and the Sioux, they didn't start out as Indians on this area. They actually were in the east, and they got pushed out by other Indians. And they kind of took over and adopted the horse that, remember, the Spanish had introduced in the 1500s, and they turned into kind of a nomadic horse raising tribe, and they hunted the buffalo, and so they completely transformed their way of life after the Spanish came and introduced the horse. Now, so when we get to the mid 1800s, this is now the federal government has to deal with these tribes, and the way they do it is just like they had basically in the East initially, small scale skirmishes, and then they form treaties. And so there were a series of treaties between 1851 and 1853 that basically set aside millions of acres for the Cheyenne and Sioux, and for a reservation. And this starts the reservation system, which established boundaries for the territory of each tribe. And the idea was that there would be a huge territory up to the north, a huge territory in the south, and then there'd be a central corridor where whites could safely pass through to get to the west coast. Of course, both sides ignored the boundaries immediately, and then war raged on for several decades. This is where you get, this is the Cowboys and Indians chapter. This is a picture from your book of the Sioux on a buffalo hunt. You can see them, riding on horses and killing a buffalo. Looks like an Indian died there too. All right, so there was a series of massacres also, or very large-scale battles. The first one we're actually going to do a project in class about, and the name is the Sand Creek Massacre. And there was this, I guess, a village of 400 Indians in Colorado, and they thought that they had peaceful relations with the soldiers, and then there was some discrepancy as to who fired the first shot, but the federal militia ran in and basically slaughtered 400 Indians. Next one is the Fetterman Massacre. On this case, actually, the Indians win. So a Sioux war party ambushed 81 soldiers and civilians in Wyoming. That was 1866. Then there's the most famous one that you've probably already heard of is the Battle of Little Bighorn, and that's where Custer, right, Custer's last stand, he kind of got lured. He and 250 soldiers got lured into a trap in Montana by over 2,500 Sioux, and every single one of the soldiers, including Custer, was killed. This is a map from your book, and it shows the different areas of these different Indian battles. So this is the Battle of Little Bighorn, which I just talked about. You can go there today. I've been there. It's really boring. It's just rolling hills, basically. This is the Sand Creek Massacre here in Colorado. I've never been there. Um, Battle of Wounded Knee, which we'll talk about. This is pretty much the last of the Indian battles. It pretty much marks the end of the Indian Wars. This is a picture or a drawing of the Battle of Little Bighorn, actually drawn by a Sioux Indian historian, and that's the leader, Crazy Horse, here in the middle, painted in spotted war paint, with all the dead soldiers with arrows in their chests and backs. All right, and then the last one is Geronimo. Geronimo was an Apache leader, and he fought not only American forces, but oftentimes he would hop across the border and fight Mexican forces for several decades until he's finally captured and killed. Um, and it's rumored that he jumped off a cliff, and as he jumped off the cliff, he said, "Me, the buffalo." So the buffalo are a native species to this area, and they're absolutely massive. You can go out there nowadays and see them and just see how gigantic they are. And there were 15 million of them at the end of the Civil War, and then 20 years later, right? So 1885, there's less than 1,000 alive, which means that they killed almost 15 million of these creatures in a 20-year time period. It was just wholesale slaughter of these animals. But they're protected now, and their numbers are increasing. So you can go out, and there's various state parks and federal parks out in this area where you can still see them. Now, here's the thing that's pretty gross. So I went out in this area a few years back, and different towns have what they call testicle festivals, and they cut off, obviously, they castrate the testicles of not only bison but also the other cows that they have, and then I don't know if they fry them or what, but then everybody like eats them, and they even have like contests on like how many testicles you can eat in 10 minutes and stuff like that. Um, yeah, it was pretty odd. Needless to say, I did not partake in the testicle festival. The end of the Indian Wars is officially in 1890, really, and the Sioux, who had already been gotten severe beatdowns over the past 10 years or so, they were stuck on reservations, and they felt bad that they were losers, and so they start to engage in something called the ghost dance, and it was something to like harken back to their native roots, and the the whites, the federal government, didn't really like the Sioux doing this because it grew in popularity among the Sioux, the different even tribes around the area, and so they thought that it was a way that they were secretly getting together, and it would rise to a rebellion. And so the Americans banned the ghost dance, and then the Sioux said no, and so they fought back, and they lost. And so the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890, that marks the end of the Indian Wars. Right around the same time period in 1887, uh, Congress passes the Dawes Severalty Act. This you get tested on this all the time, so make sure you know it. It for almost all of the tribes in the nation, or within the boundaries of America, I should say, it dissolved their tribes as a legal entity. So in other words, there is no more Apache tribe. There is no more Sioux tribe. And it wiped out the reservation. So it took away their ownership of land. And instead, it gave individual families 160 acres. So an individual Apache family would get 160 acres. And as long as they behaved and didn't scalp anybody, then they would get clean title and American citizenship in 25 years. So you can see what they're trying to do here. They're trying to turn Indians into white people, right? I mean, this were the homesteaders were going out in this area, and they were getting 160 acres. And as long as they improved it and stuff like that, they got clean title. They're trying to do the exact same thing with the Indians here. The problem is that it doesn't work, and that the Indians' culture is so much different than white or black culture that that they're just not used to this type of structure, and so many of them end up giving away or selling away their land to unscrupulous speculators, and then they have nothing. This is a picture from your book of some Lakota, which was part of the Sioux Nation, receiving rations in 1881. Remember, they had all been kind of rounded up and stuck on reservations, and then there's the buffalo, like I showed you, they're all dead at this point, and so they kind of just rely on welfare handouts from the government. So here they are waiting for their handouts, and it creates a system of dependence on the federal government, and it's definitely a blow to their collective pride. This shows you the uh, destruction of Indian land, or removal of Indian land, I should say. You can see 1790 where they were at. This is right when America is pretty much born. You can see 1860, that whole Great Plains region there is all Indian land. Then the Indian Wars, you can see they're really fought. And you can see for a while we tried to stick them all in Oklahoma, and that was called Indian Territory. And then you hear at the bottom here, you can see that the Dawes Act changed common tribal lands into individual allotments. And then the law is finally repealed in 1932, and it reestablishes the legality of the tribal entities and their land. Although, I mean, it's still being fought in the courts to this day. All right, we're going to switch away from Indians and start talking about mining. So they find a bunch of silver, a bunch of gold, a bunch of other precious metals all over the place in the West. They find a bunch in Colorado, a bunch in South Dakota. The Black Hills of South Dakota, it became a big gold area. That's where Deadwood was, and Wild Bill, and all those guys. But you can see here, it's not just a dude in a pan anymore, knee deep in a river. What they do is they kind of industrialize. Remember, we're right in the middle of the second wave of industrial revolution, and it happens in mining as well. So they hit these huge pumps and these huge hoses, and obviously they're using lots of dynamite. That's right. So they blast a hillside of dynamite until it's a bunch of rubble, and then they use these massive hoses and they just blast the water into this now rubble, and it washes away all the rock into different, I don't want to call them conveyor belts. They're actually called, I think, sluice boxes and stuff like that. And then at the bottom of the hill, there's like these much larger screens, and that sifts out the precious metals from the rock. You can see what it does to hillsides, though. I mean, you're completely changing the terrain. Any type of vegetation you're killing, and all of the hills, and even in some cases mountains, you're just getting rid of. And you're polluting all the rivers around there too. All right, cowboys. So this is a picture of your book. It shows you the different what the cowboys actually looked like back in the day. And the thing that is starting to be talked about more and more are what are called the Buffalo Soldiers, and that was that 20% of cowboys actually were African Americans. But you don't really see that in the movies, because most of the cowboy movies were done at a very racist time in Hollywood. But what did the cowboys actually do? they were usually hired by ranchers or by landowners to round up and protect their thousands and thousands of cattle. And then they would have to march them, over federal land for several weeks or months north until they got to basically a railroad station. And remember, most of the railroad lines at that time were in the north. So most of these ranches, which were in the deep south like Texas, they would have to push these giant herds of cattle and protect them for hundreds of miles or thousands of miles, I should say, and until they got them safely to a railroad station. And then you go back south and you do it again. And so this went on for a long, long time. But eventually, as all these people moved out west, they didn't want cows trampling all over their property, especially if they're growing crops. So they start to build fences. And initially, the cowboys would just move the cows around these properties. But eventually, the properties become so widespread and filled with so much fencing and barbed wire that they essentially blocked the northern passage of these giant herds of cattle. And so in the South, what the ranchers ended up doing is they started to fence in their own property. They started to purchase and ship in winter feed. Obviously, because of the railroad, they were able to do this. They also imported a different type of cow. Originally they were kind of skinny and they had giant long horns until they started to import a different type of cow. I think it was from Spain, if I remember correctly. That looks more like today, much fatter, shorter horns, and so they were able to grow fewer but heavier animals. Here's an idea of these cow drives, these northern cow drives. You can see they're always ending at a railroad station. There's the Union Pacific, which we talked a lot about. Here are some smaller ones, but they all kind of meet up. Now, what you notice here is this is Indian territory. So one of the main jobs of the cowboys was to protect the cows and themselves from Indian attack. And that's where you get all these cowboy and Indian stories. Okay, let's talk about these homesteaders. So the Homestead Act of 1862, which I think we talked about a little bit a couple chapters ago, it granted settlers 160 acres, and they got it for almost free. All they had to do is they had to live on it straight for 5 years, and they had to improve it. Now, improving it basically meant building a house on it, and you had to pay a nominal fee. And in most cases, this was like $30. So for $30 and build your house, you got 160 acres for free. And so this, massive immigration, once more migration, I should say. You got immigration coming from Europe, it goes to the East Coast, and then a bunch of people from the East Coast are moving out west. It gets to the point where by 1890, the superintendent of the census announced that there was no more frontier. We had basically gone all the way to the Pacific Ocean and everywhere in between, and that's it. The great American frontier has now ended. Now, you're going to start to see in the next chapter that almost immediately we start looking beyond our boundaries then. That the frontier just becomes other countries and we become an imperialist nation. But that's next chapter. Okay, so the problem with these homesteaders is they're getting 160 acres, 160 acres, 160 acres, but the terrain and the climate changes pretty starkly around here. Really, even around here. I was always taught, I guess, or led to believe that once you get west of the Mississippi River, that's when the rainfall drops. But it really drops here. Now, here's why. You have precipitation in the form of clouds, and it just once it hits these mountains here, it dumps whatever it has. And so this area of the country is almost tropical. And this actually is a rainforest up here, but it gets massive amounts of rainfall, so it's very, very fertile. Lots of most of the fruit that you eat that's domestically produced is in this area. Then the air passes over the Rockies, and it's going to be very dry air. And it's not until it gets to about here that's built up enough precipitation, usually from the upflow from the Gulf of Mexico, this warm, moist air, where it actually starts raining again on a regular basis. And then where we live, we get lots of rain. Not as much rain as the South, but plenty to grow crops. But if you're a farmer in this area, and I'm going to increase this area a little bit right about here, 160 acres really doesn't cut it. It's very difficult to grow enough stuff. And so what the farmers respond by doing is they plow the hell out of the soil and they turn it into super, super finely ground dirt. It's almost like dust. And if you do that, then you can grow crops. The problem is this increases soil erosion to a huge degree, and then if you have a drought, all that dust blows away. And that's actually what we get in this area right here during the 1930s. It's called the Dust Bowl, which we'll talk about. So even though it sounded like a great deal where these homesteaders are getting 160 acres, it was a very harsh existence because you really couldn't grow enough for a family on 160 acres, believe it or not, in that area at that time. There's another map from your book, and it talks about the percentage of land within a state in 2004 that's owned by the federal government. So you can see in Illinois, the federal government only owns 1.8% of the land. But if you look at a place like Nevada, the federal government still owns almost 85%. The other most important part of this chapter is the rise of the Populist Party. And the Populist Party, the whole point why this is so important is they are the antecedent of the progressive era. And the ideals of the progressive era start off and they become much more prevalent during the 1930s. And it basically is now what the Democratic Party's platform is. They can really trace their roots all the way back to the Populist Party. And it'll make more sense as we get deeper in this book and you're able to see what happens. But it starts with a bunch of pissed off farmers out west, basically. More and more people were growing crops at a higher and higher degree. And so whenever you're increasing the amount of something that you're selling, but the demand can't keep up with it, the price is going to be low, right? So the price of these crops were very low. In addition to that, we have a deflated currency. Remember all the monetary stuff we talked about last chapter. So in addition to that, the manufacturers, the industries out on the East Coast, they were successful in getting the federal government to pass a bunch of high tariffs for almost ever, right? I mean, this was Alexander Hamilton's plan was to have these tariffs even before the Industrial Revolution. So farmers were pissed. They felt that manufacturers were protected by high tariffs, but they got no tariff. They had to sell their products in the unprotected world market. So they felt that they were getting the raw end of the deal. In addition to that, all the equipment that they're purchasing, the prices were artificially high because of the tariff. So they felt that they were being abused. In addition to that, they felt that they were being abused by all these different monopolies and trusts that we talked about a couple chapters ago. So the railroad trust, right? The harvester trust, the seed trust, and of course they felt they were being screwed by the railroads as well because of the high freight rates that they had to pay as opposed to the big consumers like Carnegie and Rockefeller. So they form a bunch of kind of local parties. The biggest one is called the Grange Party, which you really don't have to know about. But eventually all of these parties kind of consolidate and merge into the People's Party. And the common name for the People's Party is the Populist. So you can call it the People's Party or the Populist Party, it doesn't matter. Well, it merges in the 1890s. And I showed you a chapter ago a table of what they were in, what they wanted. Here's just another reminder. They wanted the nationalization of railroads to get rid of the high freight rates. They wanted the nationalization of the telephone. They wanted a graduated income tax. So in other words, poor people would pay a very low percentage or no percentage, and rich people would pay a high percentage. They wanted access to easy credit, so you'd almost have multiple branches of the Bank of the United States out west. They would provide easy credit and kind of co-ops where that would just store their uh, their their crops until the marketplace was high. So in other words, they would create an artificial demand for it really, and then sell the crops then at the higher price. And the biggest thing probably is that they wanted free and unlimited coinage of silver. Remember, if you're a debtor, you want inflation. You want an increase in the money supply because that'll mean that first off, it's easier access to credit. In addition to that, the money that you're paying back to the bank is worth less than the amount of money that you borrowed from the bank initially. That's why inflation is good for a debtor. And if we're on the gold standard at this time period and there's only so much gold, then their idea, and it was kind of crude, but it did make sense, that if you just add another precious metal to the money supply, in this case silver, you're going to increase the money supply. So that was their plan. There's a picture from your book of homesteaders in front of their sod house. They're also called sodders. Um, like the pretty dirty existence. Then your book talks about the Pullman strike and the Panic of 1893, which we've already talked about a little bit. So the Panic of 1893, which is created by overspeculation and all that good stuff that recessions are always caused. Remember, the panic forces a lot of businesses on the East Coast to close, and unemployment shoots up because all those workers get fired. So the Populist Party thought that the Panic of 1893 was going to drive a lot of Eastern laborers, the workers, the working class, into their party because they felt that they had common enemy in the oppressive political and economic system. Really, it's all that 99% stupid argument that the hipsters were doing a couple years ago. Then you get the Pullman strike of 1894, and again it shows the plight of the Eastern labor. And the Pullman strike happens in Chicago, and really the major player in that is Eugene Debs, which we're going to talk about for several chapters from now on. He helped organize the American Railway Union, and you have the Pullman, which was a company town actually, just south of Chicago. Actually, it's right where Gately Stadium is now. If you look right across the street from Gately, there's still some of the old Pullman factory buildings there. And if you worked at Pullman, you made railroad cars, and you lived in an apartment that was owned by the Pullman company, and you went to churches that were owned by the Pullman company, and you shopped at stores that were owned by the Pullman company. You paid all of this with Pullman bucks. Well, because of the panic in 1893, the recession, not as many people were buying Pullman cars. And so what Pullman did is he slashed workers' wages by I think a third, but he didn't reduce the cost of their apartments or anything like that. So they go on strike, right? And then, of course, the federal government at this time, which sided with big business, sided with Pullman and ended the strike, claimed that they were halting the sending of the federal mail, so that was a federal crime. So remember, the populists now think that they have a partner in the Eastern worker. And so we get now to the election of 1896, and the issue is going to be whether we stick with the gold standard or inflate the currency by monetizing silver. Really exciting stuff. So you get McKinley, who was Republican, and he wanted to stick with the gold standard, which makes sense because Republicans were allied with big business, with big credit, with big banks, and they did not want inflation. They, if anything, wanted deflation, or at least the status quo. So that means stick with the gold standard. On the other hand, you get this guy who we're going to talk about for a few chapters now. Now, Williams Jennings Bryan, he, a unique individual, a very, very loud, a little bit obnoxious, but what you can see here is the problem that the Democrat Party, which kind of had lost its way, right? I mean, they were the dominant party prior to the Civil War, and then really were very, very weak and decentralized after the Civil War. Well, they and the Populist Party, which was a third party, they actually both endorsed William Jennings Bryan. So he's technically in both parties at this time period running for president. And he, of course, argued in favor of silver. And he utters at some campaign rally the most famous speech, that his Cross of Gold speech. And I have the quote here from his speech. "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." In other words, you're screwing over everybody by sticking to the gold standard. You got to help people by adopting the silver. This is McKinley's campaign headquarters in Chicago, 1896. And again, look at the demographics of who his campaign workers are here. And they're all African American. And this just goes to show you that the African Americans were very, very loyal and supportive to the Republican Party still during this time period, 1896. It's not until the Great Depression in the 1930s that their allegiance shifts to the Democrats. Well, McKinley wins. And he wins because all of those Eastern working class individuals, they don't vote for William Jennings Bryan. And, it basically showed the lack of appeal that the Populist Party and the Democrats had to the unmortgaged farmer. If you owned your own house and you had clean title and you had paid off your mortgage already, that you really don't care about the populist stuff, right? And the Eastern urban labor, remember, their wages didn't fluctuate based on the international market. They were actually protected by these tariffs, right? And so if you add money to the money supply, and they're still getting whatever, $1 a day. Now that dollar is worth less. So they were kind of anti-inflation. And if you know drop down the tariffs and you have free trade, well then some other European manufacturers may come in and eat up American manufacturing, and of course that would cause them to lose their jobs. So they didn't have any reason to join in the cause of the populists, and so they didn't. So that's why they voted for McKinley. And the Populist Party and the Western farmers, they really felt betrayed by this. You can see here's a map of the election of 1896 and how popular McKinley was in the industrial area, right? I mean, this is big industry in America during this time period. And you can see from a geographic standpoint, Bryan, clearly wins, but he's winning in territories and areas where not a whole lot of people are living at. And so, even though it was fairly close, 51% to 48 or so percent in the popular vote, in the electoral vote, it's not close at all, 61% to 39%. This is a political cartoon depicting William Jennings Bryan and his infamous Cross of Gold. And here's the last slide of the thing. So you have here, between 1700 and 1800, this is when the Cheyenne, and the Sioux actually move into the Great Plains area. They weren't there for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's in the aftermath of the introduction of the Spanish horse, and they got their butts kicked there by the Eastern Indians. You get a couple other areas of the precious metals being found there: Pikes Peak, Comstock Lode. You get the Homestead Act, 1864. You get the Sand Creek Massacre. Then that National Grange. This is one of the first farmers' a grievance political organizations. You get the Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876. You get local chapters of the Farmers Alliance. Like I said, another one of these kind of farmer political parties are forming. You get the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887. Then you get the end of the frontier in 1890, and the emergence of the People's Party. So all these other farmer parties start to consolidate into the People's Party, 1890. Battle of Wounded Knee, 1891. Then you get the Pullman Strike, 1894. And that's about it. See you later.